All right, we should be live. So,
Cool, brilliant.
all right, yeah. So obviously, I'm a fan of the argument from contingency. We can talk about other arguments for God as well, but I'll
Yeah.
present my version. If you've watched any of my debates or videos, then you might be familiar with how I present it. But basically, I define necessary as something which is and it could not have been otherwise, and contingent as something that is or could be and could have been otherwise. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so that's just the starting definitions I'm working with. So, in principle, contingent things, even if they always exist or always have existed, could fail to exist because just by the nature of the fact that they're contingent. So, that's the first part of the argument. The
Mm-hmm.
second part is if all the contingent things cease to be, if they cease to exist, whatever state of reality that would be left would be a necessary state of reality. I'm going to argue that that's just simply by definition of the terms.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third stage of the argument is a necessary state of reality can't have contingent properties by definition. And then the final part is that limitations, I'm going to say, are contingent because limitations, as in any sort of finite feature, could have been otherwise. So, like something's 6 feet or something's green and so on, that could have been otherwise. So, the necessary state of reality cannot have limitations. And then finally, something without limitations has the divine attributes because it's unlimited in its power, in its consciousness, in its charity, in its justice. It's not limited by space and time, so you have a spaceless, timeless, necessary, all powerful, all knowing, all charitable reality, and that's what we mean by God.
Okay. Well, thank you for outlining your argument for me. I would like to bring up my first, I guess, issue,
Sure.
and that is, as I'm sure you've heard, is I guess Bertrand Russell's response to that was to just say that the universe was just the brute fact, and that was the necessary thing that existed. I'm just wondering what you thought about
All right, yeah, so Russell's objection. I think that that is a valid objection to the type of version that, like, Leibniz put forward or like William Lane Craig argues
that.
today. That's based on the principle of sufficient reason. I'm inclined to think the principle of sufficient reason is true and that there aren't brute facts. However, the version that I'm putting forward, I don't think hinges on the principle of sufficient reason being true because I'm basing it more on the law of non contradiction. So even if
Okay.
there could be brute facts, I'm going to say that that doesn't
Okay.
touch this version.
Yeah.
So,
Well, all that I really meant by that was that the universe could be the necessary thing, and that
okay.
there is no need to, I guess, go one stage further and to say that God must be, I guess, behind the universe. I believe that the universe could be the necessary thing, but I I'm familiar that you said that that couldn't be the reason because the universe is limited and that the necessary thing must be unlimited in nature. Um, yeah, I remember watching your video on that when when you were saying that. I don't quite accept it. Uh, the I don't accept that the necessary thing must be unlimited, and I just like to hear why you would say that it had to be unlimited in nature.
Sure. Yeah, so Russell's objection seems to be more that the universe could be contingent, but yeah, you could. There is that sort of objection by like Spinoza or some others that the universe could be necessary. And yeah, I mean, conceptually, like at the second stage of the argument, I can grant that the second stage of the argument just proves that, or at least indicates that there's something necessary, and in principle, that could be the universe. But then, as you
Yeah,
brought up, my objection then is, well, the universe has limitations; it doesn't have
yeah.
the divine attributes. And then it sounds like you're wondering, well, then why does the necessary reality have to lack limitations? Is that, and that sounds like that's where your objection is at this point.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to argue, and I think this is the linchpin of the argument. So,
Okay.
um, so yeah, like I think this is where the argument makes or breaks. So I think the objection you're raising is fair. Is that limitations, I think, are contingent just by conceptual analysis. That a limitation can have variation. It can be limited in this way or some other way. I mean, an infinite number of ways. And I'm going to say limitations are by their very nature contingent. So if something is a necessary reality, it can't be made up of contingent properties. And if limitations are contingent properties, it can't have limitations. So it really comes down to if limitations are contingent properties or not. And I think that they clearly are. So that's where I'm coming
Okay,
from.
right. So would we be in agreement in saying that the universe is limited? We would be agreeing in that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. I mean, if the universe wasn't limited, I mean, there would be God in the traditional classical sense. So yeah.
Uh, okay. Um. Uh. So we would you agree that we would we could conclude that something is contingent if we could conceive it as not existing or being otherwise? Okay. Um. Could it not be possible that something could exist and it could be conceivable that it couldn't exist, or conceivable that it could be different, but in some sense it had to be that although we could conceive of its non-existence, it, I guess it still had to exist.
Sure.
Um, I don't. Yeah, typically or at least the way that I've seen it and understood it, the way that we determine whether or not something is contingent is whether or not we could conceive of its existence or non-existence. But I don't accept that to be any guide to contingency or necessity. I I guess that is an issue for me. I Of course we can conceive of the universe. Not maybe we conceive the universe as not existing, but we can certainly conceive of being different. But again, I don't accept that as a guide to the actual nature of necessity or contingency.
Sure. Okay, yeah, that's a good objection. So there's 2 points here. So I do think conceivability is legitimate to use in metaphysical discussions, but I do recognize that there's a controversial component
Mm,
to that because there is that kind of like, how do we know that conceivability really works? And I
yeah.
can get where that's coming from. I don't know that I don't know that my argument necessarily rests upon conceivability being legitimate or not
Okay.
because um, I think it comes down to if we're applying this concept of contingent and limitation, is it an appropriate label or not? So if you say, well, maybe these limitations they just are necessary,
Mm-hmm.
I mean you can definitely throw that out there, and I guess conceivability could be a way to attack that, but I'm also gonna say that it seems like an appropriate label because there could have been other like a limitation in and of itself is a modality. It's a variation. So maybe that individual, like let's just say for the sake of argument, that individual item could not have been otherwise. Let's just say,
Mm-hmm.
but is it contingent in that could there have been something else that has a different limitation? And I guess if you're going to push back and say maybe not, you may just have a different intuition there. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say if something is 5 feet, it certainly seems legitimate to think that it could have been 6 feet, or that
Yeah.
there could be something that is 6 feet. That there could be, because for example, think of something that's spatially confined. Um, it seems like there could be more of reality outside of that thing. So any
Mm-hmm.
sort of confinement to say that that's the ground of existence, that that's the final stopping point, is that confined reality. I just find that fairly implausible to say that there just couldn't,
Yeah.
and maybe that does rest upon conceivability, but I guess
Yeah.
that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying, and
Yeah.
I agree certainly that intuitively it does seem that if something is 5 feet, that it could have been otherwise. But I am very, very skeptical to trust my intuition. I or take conceivability as a guide, um, which for me is a big problem. For I guess me agreeing with the contingency argument. Uh, it's yeah, I do have a bit of a problem with the notion of I guess us determining contingency through the process of conceivability. Sure, it does seem intuitive, but I'm very skeptical of trusting my intuition or anyone's for that matter.
Sure. I mean, I think that all arguments are going to come down to some sort of intuition. You're going to have some, or at least from my perspective, somebody's going to need some starting point, some foundation where they say this just seems correct.
Yeah.
And I'm going to, I mean, like, I think that that's ultimately where you're going to come from in your objection
Mm.
to conceivability. You're going to say, I have this strong intuition that I should be skeptical of my intuitions. And I mean, I mean, it could end up being self defeating in a way.
Well, I guess if you certainly if you phrase it as uh, that I have an intuition that we should be skeptical of intuitions, but that's I don't know if I would quite phrase it like that. Um, and I guess you're right that that is that could be a problem for all arguments. I guess attacking intuition, but uh, there are certain things that I am willing to accept through intuition that well, not as truths about reality, but I guess as truths about the way that the mind works, such as I guess the laws of classical logic, law of non-contradiction, law of identity. I don't accept them to be, I guess, true about the universe. But uh, uh, how how to put this? Um, to an extent about the way the mind works, I'd be willing to accept them. But I'm very very skeptical about still about them about just referring to the universe.
Sure. Okay. So about like the laws of logic applying to the universe. I mean, yeah, and this has been brought up before, like in my debate with Tom Jump. So, um, my position, I was trying to clarify, isn't on the laws of logic that there isn't like some law out there, like the law of non-contradiction, that we
Yeah,
could go into like
restricted.
the, yeah, we could go into like the Platonic heaven and find the law
Yeah,
of non-contradiction. I don't hold that view, but it's hard to. I mean, it's just sort of to me. There's nothing more obviously true than the idea that something, call it item X, couldn't exist and fail to exist at the same time. Like that just seems more obviously true than anything, and then that
yeah.
would be an application of the law of non-contradiction to a concrete object, and that's where I would just say like I'm not that skeptical there. So
Mm. I agree that certainly I can't imagine an object both existing and not existing, or being taller than 8 feet and smaller than 3 feet. I can't imagine it, but I don't take I guess the scope of my imagination to be any uh, trustworthy guide to what could be outside my mind.
hmm.
Yeah.
So what would you say if I were to ask, what do you think is the most, and maybe you don't have an answer on this, but what do you think is the most obviously true, or at least one of the most obviously true claims?
Personally, for me, I, I think it's obvious that I am having an experience that I am having an experience of being in a call with you and in a room with a desk. Uh, but that's I'm inclined to say that's as far as I would go.
Okay. Now, would your support for that be an argument like Descartes' cogito ergo sum, or would it be something else?
Wouldn't put it as an I guess in the form of an argument. I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. I don't come to my belief that I'm having an experience through argument, through deduction. It's more of a just a sort of a foundational and empirical uh, thing approach, I guess. I can't deny that I'm at least having an experience, you know.
Sure. Well, what about, Descartes' initial worry about how do I know, or how do you know, or whoever's making the claim, that you're
Yeah.
not an illusion of yourself?
But I mean, I guess I don't. The most I can know that at least there are thoughts, there are an experience. Um, the I guess the nature and the source of those thoughts and those experiences are a mystery. But I at least agree that there are thoughts and experiences, and that's the one I guess obvious truth I would accept.
Right. I mean, and I definitely agree that that's obvious, but I guess the obviousness of it to me comes through when we think that, like Descartes' argument, like if I didn't exist, I couldn't doubt my own existence. So you see that there's a
yeah,
clear contradiction, but then that rests upon the law of non-contradiction applying to yourself, and then it
yeah,
seems like, well, it tacitly accepts that the law of non-contradiction applies to reality after all, and then that opens the door to other arguments that could do the same, is at least where I'm coming from on that.
mm. I also I think that Descartes' argument cogito ergo sum makes the fallacy of begging the question, where in premise one that begins with I think, it presupposes I guess that there is such an um, which also I think that's a bit of a problem for that. That's a reason why I don't accept it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've heard that type of objection before. I don't
Yeah,
know that I agree that it begs the question because, I mean, it could beg the question in your view, but you may accept that because you do accept that you have an experience. But I don't know that it begs the question because I don't think he's committed to a certain metaphysical view about the nature of the person in order for it to work. I mean, he could replace it with my experience is thinking, and I can't have experience of thinking without. It doesn't have to have this
yeah.
I.
Well, I guess the way you phrase it does suffer from a similar problem by the first word is my. It sort of assumes there is such an I. You know.
Sure. Well, I mean, but you would. It seems like you would agree, though, that there is a sort of starting point, your own experience, and he's,
Uh-huh.
working from
Yeah.
there.
Experience certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, and then he's raising the question: could that experience not exist? And then and then he works out from there and says, well, if that experience didn't exist, the experience wouldn't be able to doubt its own existence, and that leads to an obvious contradiction. So the experience has to exist. And I don't know that it begs a question. It does certainly assume there is an experience going on, but I mean, to me, that, and it seems like you would agree that that's totally obvious.
Well, I don't. I would what I would say is that I think that it assumes not that there is an experience, but there is an experiencer with the by starting off with I think. That is a big problem for me.
Okay. But what if it was rephrased as in there is experience, or there is conscious experience?
Mhm.
I mean, would that make it a little more less question begging seeming?
Well, yeah, I would certainly. It's a premise I would accept. Yeah, that there is experience, but uh, I I am skeptical as to whether experience requires an experiencer. Perhaps thoughts can exist without a thinker.
Hmm. Okay. But well, even if that were the case, though, like let's just say that, I don't mean, I don't know if that's coherent or not, but let's say that that's the case. Then what if you replace the first premise was with there are thoughts, thoughts doubt their existence? Could that be a palatable way to go?
Well, I think if you were going down that route, the argument would go, um, there are thoughts, thoughts doubt its own existence, therefore thoughts must exist because in order to doubt their existence, they must exist. But all that all that concludes is the first premise of the argument that thoughts exist. It doesn't get us closer to establishing a person behind or a thinker behind the thoughts.
Sure, it doesn't establish a subsistent entity behind the thoughts necessarily if you're going to make this distinction between the thoughts and the mind, but it would establish that there are those thoughts. And if that's the
Yeah,
case,
yeah.
I think that that's strong enough for my purpose here in showing that that would be a case where the law of non-contradiction helps us arrive at a conclusion about reality.
Well, um, I don't know if I would say that it helps us arrive at a conclusion about reality. It does seem that um, intuitively it's inescapable, but again, I am skeptical about uh, trusting our intuition as a guide to the way a mind external world works and operates.
Okay, so where do you draw this distinction then applying? I mean, it sounds like you're okay with applying logic to within your own conscious framework. Would that be correct?
Yeah, sure. I am. I the way I understand logic is sort of a description about what my mind can digest. I can't, I can't imagine a married bachelor, but I don't use that as a, I don't trust that as a guide to say that there could not exist married bachelors.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I just have a really strong intuition in the other way. I just think that, I mean, a married bachelor is just obviously impossible,
Uh,
but it might just be where we have just a different view.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, I agree that at least to the extent that I cannot imagine what such a thing would look like, a married bachelor. But again, I'm skeptical about intuition.
Okay, so it seems like then your view of the law of non-contradiction is, and maybe this isn't correct, but correct me, it's
Mm.
more of a sort of Kantian or pragmatic use of it. It's like, yeah, it helps us make sense of things for our own experience, but it may have no applicability to reality. Is that accurate?
Um, I don't know if I would say that it's. Uh, I would say that it was in a pragmatic sense. I I guess how do I put this? It's certainly I don't think it was pragmatic. Um, the the reason that I accept at least the law of non-contradiction insofar as a description of my experience is because I believe that um, I guess sort of through a empiricist foundationalist approach it is undeniable to me at least. But I don't accept that it tells us anything about the way the world works.
Okay. So, and so it seems like to me, and maybe I don't know if how much you've studied of this, so I don't know if it's going to be appropriate or not. But like with like Kant's view that we have these sort of, at least my understanding of Kant, that we have these sort of pre-built categories to understand reality, but it doesn't really tell us about how reality really is. Would you say like that's close to your view? So like the law of non-contradiction, like we use it, but it doesn't really touch reality at all, or at least we don't know that it does. Is that kind of like
Um,
your view?
uh, may, Maybe not exactly. I am I'm not familiar with Kant's view in that, but to put my view simply, it's that the laws such as the law of non-contradiction are merely a description of the behaviour of my mind and the behaviour of my experiences and what my mind can digest and nothing more. That's it.
Okay. And this might be repetitive, but do you think it's possible for your mind to exist and fail to exist at the same time, or your experiences?
Um, well, you said, is it possible for my mind to exist and not exist?
At the same time, right?
Um, my answer to that would just have to be I don't know. I uh, I don't trust my intuition of the law of non-contradiction to tell me anything about the workings of reality.
Okay. And then why do you, so my starting point, as I said, is that the law of non-contradiction is the most obvious starting point to me. Why would you
Yeah.
take your experience as the most, or however you would map out your whole epistemological framework? Why is that the most? Why is that more obvious than the law of non-contradiction?
Uh, it seems totally. It just seems totally undeniable to me that I'm at least having an experience. My experiences might not reflect the way the world actually works. I may be a brain on a bat, but what I cannot deny is that I'm at least having these experiences. Um, and I think maybe, perhaps what you're thinking is, Jordan, you can't deny that you're having experience, but can you deny the law of non-contradiction? If uh, if the inability to doubt it is sufficient for experience, then why not for the law of non-contradiction? Um, the answer to that would be that I guess I can doubt. the law of non-contradiction reflects reality in any way. That there's still this barrier between my mind and everything external to it. Reality. I can't imagine anything that would be inconsistent with the law of non-contradiction. But I can still say perhaps the world doesn't work that way. The world doesn't is not consistent with my intuitions and thoughts about how it may be, even the strongest ones.
Right. And I guess to me, okay, so that seems like that whole statement is your starting point. That's your foundation. So that whole foundation seems more obvious than anything else. Like that would be, is that right to say?
Well, I would say that it is. I wouldn't so much say more obvious. I would just say it is the only thing that is obvious to me. I would say.
Okay. And would you say what makes it obvious is that it's self-evident, or you just haven't been convinced? Or I mean, I guess yeah. I mean, would you say it's because it's self-evident?
Yeah, I think that is a good word to use. Self-evident. Yeah.
Yeah, I think all of our starting points to everybody at some point has to be some self-evident claim. And I know that some don't like saying that because they think like, oh, well, if self-evident, then somebody can't contest that. But like, I just
Yeah.
don't see how somebody's going to have any sort of starting. I mean, you're going to either lead to infinite regress
Mm.
or some sort of circular reasoning, or you're going to have to admit that there's a self-evident, or you have a presupposition. And those other, presupposition, infinite regress, circular reasoning are, of course, to me, just totally baseless. So yeah, I think you got to
Yeah.
have a self-evident foundation at some point.
Yeah. Well, I guess sort of relating back to the contingency argument, my skepticism surrounding taking conceivability as a guide to contingency is a major problem for me. Um, yeah, that's a major problem for me accepting the contingency argument. Um, because I see around me a whole bunch, many things, and it seems I guess intuitive that they could have not, they may not have existed or existed in some other form, but I don't trust my intuition to tell me the truth. Perhaps all these things, sitting at my desk around me, just had to be. There was no other way that it could have been, and despite my intuitions to the contrary, that just is the case.
So let me ask you this:
Yeah.
um, if there was no, and again, this will get into some other issues. If there was no space-time, do you think that material objects would exist?
Well, my answer to that would be that um, I guess because material objects are, they're spatio-temporal. It seems inconceivable that they could. It does seem to, my mind lapses into contradiction, trying to imagine. I can't do it, but once again, I don't trust I don't trust conceivability as a guide to contingency or anything really.
Okay. I mean, to me, like that point seems to go beyond conceivability, but I suppose these things kind of all border on each other. Because, like, if one thing, it's like I could say, oh, I could conceive of, my mind existing in a inside the body of a bird, and like, that's an argument that gets made sometimes about like dualism and things. But like, saying like, could material objects exist without space time? To me almost seems definitional that they couldn't,
Yeah,
but I suppose there is a component of conceivability within that. We are, imagining things and then imagining it having been otherwise. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you take, that sort of epistemology, then the argument may not be convincing to you. I don't take that epistemology. I don't find it convincing. I find this other, applying the law of non-contradiction and conceivability, at least in
yeah,
some sort, to reality is, I find it pretty obvious. But you know,
yeah. I still think that you don't have to be as skeptical as that to reject the contingency argument. I think that you can still accept. Um, you can still accept, I guess, the rules of classical logic to reflect reality, and you still accept the truth of analytic propositions, propositions that are true by definition, and but still this gap exists between conceivability and what is necessary and what is contingent. Uh, yeah, I still don't accept that as a guide. Um, but I guess another problem that I have with the contingency argument is, I guess, human causation. I don't accept really that. I guess there is such a thing as classical causation. That is another issue for me. And I know that um, there are how do I put this? There are other forms of contingency argument that don't, I guess, rest on, I guess, causation. Uh, like there's a sort of a sustainability form of the contingency argument, which accepts that even if the universe is eternal and the God did not actually cause it to exist, that you know God self sustains it to exist. And I guess skepticism about causation doesn't really affect that. But yeah, that is my two major problems with the contingency argument.
Sure. Yeah, so that second part is really important because, yeah, the classical contingent, like the version that I'm putting forward, isn't about the beginning of the universe, like how the kalam argument, it's about
Yeah,
a sustainer. So sometimes when people raise objections about causality and such, yeah, I don't see that as necessarily applying to the contingency argument. I mean, it can, but I agree with your point that it does depend upon the version. Because I'm willing to grant certain pretty modest statements about causality, and I still think the argument would work. But I'll let you respond to that. But I do want to respond to your first point about, or your other point about conceivability. Just going back to that for a second. So I
yeah,
guess
yeah.
to me, I can see where there's a kind of skepticism about conceive. I'm not a skeptic of conceivability because I think
Mm-hmm.
it's merely recognizing what's I just don't have a problem with it.
Yeah,
The other point was that I guess I think that there are various degrees of conceivability because sometimes people could say like, well, I could conceive of such and such working, and there's kind of a skepticism like, well, do you really know that something could work like that? And it's like not within a given framework. Like maybe given our laws of physics, things couldn't work that way, but given all of reality as a whole, if I could conceive of it, I don't really see what's stopping it. But anyways, the point I really wanted to get to was that it seems like, in your view, or your possible objection, that could the universe be necessary, depending upon what you mean by universe, but assuming you mean some sort of collection or some sort of limited state. I guess to me, it just seems really intuitively obvious that if something is limited,
mm,
it it's not the final stopping point. There could be some further reality beyond it, and I guess that does kind of rest on a kind of conceivability. But to
yeah,
me, it seems almost definitional, and that's to me where the universe just obviously seems, just from a conceptual standpoint, to be contingent. Because if you're going to say it's necessary, it seems like you'd have to be committed to that it is the final fundamental stopping point of reality. There could literally not be anything more fundamental in any possible world. And to me, that almost seems definitionally false. And you might disagree with me on this, but I guess that's where I'm coming from.
yeah. Yeah, I must say that I don't seem to have the same problem imagining the universe being the necessary thing. Um, yeah, I, I, I remember what I think I was watching a debate you were involved in where you were arguing why something limited could not be uh, could not be the necessary thing, and you said that a necessary thing could not be limited because there is nothing else there to limit it. So is that what you said? Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. So that's not the only reason, but to me, it's like because there are several different angles that somebody could take. So one
Mm,
point is if something is the most fundamental component of reality or state,
mm,
there's nothing outside of it to limit it, because that could be one proposal. Somebody could say, well,
yeah,
maybe there's something else that limits it. And I would say, well, there's nothing else to limit it.
yeah,
And so that would be one prong. And then somebody could say, well, maybe it just happens to be limited. And I would
mm,
say if it just happens to be limited, then that seems contingent because it's just a happenstance. And then it seems like the third approach, you could say maybe it's necessarily limited. And to me, then that seems to be more where you're coming from. And I would just say it just doesn't, that just seems to not jibe with the idea that if it's the most fundamental reality,
mm,
then there's nothing else that could possibly be beyond it. It seemed like by definition, and then if that's the case, to me that just doesn't. If it's limited, it seems like it couldn't be the final stopping point. But so, anyways, that's
yeah.
hopefully that answers what you're asking.
Um, yeah, I guess my initial thoughts when when I was watching you, you say that in your debate was that I guess it sort of assumed that unless there exists something else to limit it, then then it would be unlimited. But I guess I just didn't see any reason to accept that. I thought that I guess I thought why couldn't it just be limited? Not limited by anything else, but just happen to be limited. And you did say that that does seem awfully contingent. If something just happens to be limited, it seems more of a happenstance. But couldn't I mean this? I don't know if this might sound silly, but couldn't something just happen to be unlimited as well?
Couldn't okay.
Would that
Um,
just seem equally happenstance?
well, I would say that if you grant that there's something necessary, then whatever is necessary couldn't just happen to be. So, like, say if we're gonna reach the conclusion that whatever is necessary would have to be unlimited, then they would correspond. So, it might seem that way initially, but then the two ends meet in the middle. If you see what I'm saying there, that no, it couldn't be that way.
Mm. Yeah, well, I guess I guess I just don't share the same intuition that um whenever the necessary thing that exists has to be unlimited. I really don't have a problem imagining that it has limitations. That's a bit of a sticking point for me.
So, right, and I get that, but now, when you're talking about a necessary thing, though, are you imagining? Because I mean, I used to think that that was a valid objection to the contingency argument as well.
Mm,
I mean, at least I was convinced by that objection as something that was a stumbling block for the argument. But when we say it's, or at least when I'm arguing something's necessary, I just want to be clear that I'm not arguing simply that it's eternal, but that it
mm,
is the ground of existence. There couldn't even possibly be anything sustaining it or outside of it. Is that where you're also? Are you acknowledging that that's the definition I'm working with?
yeah, yeah, I
Okay.
agree. It's I guess I would put it as just something that could not fail to exist, had to exist in all possible worlds, in all possible circumstances. That's the
Right.
definition that I've been going with.
Right. But also on top of that, that there couldn't be anything more fundamental than it.
Um, I would, if it's okay, could you clarify a little bit more about what you mean by there couldn't be anything more fundamental than it?
Sure. So, like, by fundamental, I mean sustaining or undergirding. So, like, molecules are fundamental to our skin. Like, our skin couldn't be without molecules.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess if what you mean is that it's not that thing is not contingent upon anything else, then yeah.
Well, not just that it's not, but that it couldn't be.
Um, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, I guess that's where I really see as being really important in regards to if you're going to say that something limited is necessary, then it's also the most fundamental. and that something not even could be undergirding of it. And I guess that's where I have a lot of skepticism about the plausibility that something limited could be that most fundamental reality. Like the idea that quirks or space-time or whatever, that's the final stopping point. It could not have had any, there couldn't be anything more ultimate than that. I mean, to me, definitionally, those types of a limited feature is not the most ultimate. And I mean, you could say, well, I'm using conceivability here. In a way, I am, but to me, it just seems very definitional. But I know that there are intuitions at work here. So
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would like to, clarify a distinction between, I guess, conceivability and analyticity, and
sorry,
that are
conceivability and what was the other word?
analytic, analytic statements. Truth by definition. Um, I think that it's it might be a struggle, or it might be impossible to conceive that something limited could be the necessary thing, but I don't find that it's false by definition.
Right, I would say it's false by definition in the way that like a married bachelor. I mean, I know we had the discussion about a married bachelor, so it's not false by definition. But to me, it's. I mean, it does rest upon conceivability, but to me, I guess it's a modest form of conceivability. To me, it just seems really obvious to me. But I know that we have like if you imagine something limited, like imagine a circle, and I could imagine that circle expanding and expanding, and I guess to me, it seems like your objection is, well, we could imagine that circle expanding, but for all we know, that's impossible. And to me, that seems just kind of arbitrary. And maybe you're saying, well, maybe reality is like that. I don't know. It kind of, to me, it strips meaning from the concept of contingent. It seems like we have the word contingent for a reason. And if anything's contingent, it's appropriate to call that circle contingent. I could imagine it having different definitions, or excuse me, different dimensions, and that seems totally appropriate. The idea that that would be necessary to me just seems really arbitrary. And you might just say, well, yeah, well, maybe, I mean, you're probably going to say reality just could be that way. And I guess I'm just skeptical of I, I just don't have any reason to think that this isn't legitimate. But,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. You mentioned there was something about, I guess the concept of contingency losing its meaning. Um, I was, I would like to just add something about that because I think that the concept of contingency itself is a little bit, um, I guess, vague and ambiguous. I was watching there's something I'd like to ask your thoughts on. I was watching a debate between, Alex O'Connor, cosmic skeptic, and she was debating was it Cameron Bertuzzi?
Yeah, I've seen that
Yeah.
debate, yeah.
Uh, so Alex brought up determinacy of the universe, and that of course, it's conceivable that uh, you know, we we didn't have this conversation, but because everything in the universe, if determinacy is true, then everything in the universe had to be the way it was because of prior causes, and contingency kind of loses its meaning there because things could not have been different. And I just wanted to know what you think about
Yeah, I remember him raising that objection, and that has gotten raised at points in the discussion. I think that it kind of misses a step in the argument because the argument, of course, is principally about the whatever is most fundamental, so the most fundamental structure. So even if determinacy is true,
that.
although I'm not a determinist, but um, if the fundamental components, the laws of physics and so on, the particles that would lead to the determinacy um, could have failed to have been otherwise. So, but like let's just say for the sake of an internal critique, he could say, well, let's just say God exists and God had to. So like Peter Van Inwegen and some others have raised this argument, like what if God had to create the type of universe that He has? Then everything's necessary, and therefore there is nothing contingent. and therefore the argument fails because either everything's necessary and the universe is necessary now, or God's decision was contingent and now things seem contingent all over. I know
yeah,
that there's more to it than that, but I just think that that objection kind of misses a beat in the argument because in that situation, the universe still would causally depend upon God. So,
mhm,
in that sense, it's contingent in that the features did not have to causally subsist in the way that they do. They still depend upon something else, and thereby they still would be contingent, even if they had to come about deterministically. The point is, they don't exist on their own. So I
mhm,
would say that would be my response there.
yeah. I guess if uh, sure if the universe was caused to exist by God and He sustains it, and in that sense, the universe would be dependent on God. If if everything if determinism is true and everything is necessary, and God's decision to create the universe and sustain the universe is necessary, then it does seem to me it doesn't seem that in just in what sense the is the universe contingent if it has to exist and cannot not exist because of the necessity of God's decision to create and sustain it. Contingency doesn't seem to make any sense.
It wouldn't make sense in the. I don't know if we can make a distinction here. Things wouldn't be contingent in an event sense,
Mm,
but they would still be contingent in a substantial sense. And those are just sort of words that I'm coining for this.
yeah,
I think that that is something that like Van Inwagen and others who raise this objection kind of miss that point because it's like, sure, the event would have to be of God producing the universe, so the universe would be necessary as an event, but it wouldn't be necessary in the sense of subsisting on its own. And at least the traditional way of putting forth the argument is that that's really all you would need to establish this the distinction between a contingent and necessary being.
okay, okay, yeah,
I don't know if you got everything I was saying. That kind of I just coined some terms, but that's the way I look at that. So.
yeah. An explanation that I heard about once, which I thought was good, was that a thing is contingent if if you say, let's say that object B is contingent upon object A, um, object B would be contingent upon object A if, in the absence of object A, object B failed to exist or stopped existing. And I think it does sort of solve that, I guess, objection about determinism necessity to the
Right,
contingency argument.
right, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess that does sort of almost sum up my objections to the contingency argument.
All right. Yeah, I think that was a really good exploration of that argument. I think, yeah. I mean, I don't know how much time you got. We could explore another argument if you'd
Yeah,
like, or.
I'll probably fit in time for one more, but
All right.
there's quite a lot we could possibly talk about. There's talk about the ontological argument, the kalam, and the moral argument. It's any any one that you prefer.
All right. Yeah, all of those are interesting. I mean, I don't. Do you have a preference there?
Um, I guess it is up to you. I guess the kalam or the moral argument. That would
Sure.
be quite interested in that.
All right,
Um,
sure.
yeah,
Let's talk about the moral argument since the kalam is a little bit
it is a bit
similar to the
yeah,
argument we were just talking about in some ways. I guess to summarize on the kalam, well, I don't know, maybe
uh,
we'll save that for another time. Let's just get into
uh,
the moral argument.
yeah,
So, yeah, there are different versions of the moral argument, and some I think are better than others. I think that it's an intuitively plausible argument that I used to find convincing.
mm,
I actually don't think that it works as a proof, or at least as a deductive proof of God.
yeah,
I think it can work, or at least can be convincing inductively or abductively, but Yeah, I mean, I think the Euthyphro dilemma is a legitimate response to the moral argument, and I don't think the responses that have been offered in
Yeah,
response to the Euthyphro dilemma have escaped it from my perspective, so I see that as undercutting the argument. So,
yeah, I do. I'm quite a fan of William Lane Craig's response to the Euthyphro dilemma, and that it's God's nature. I do like that response. Um, the I guess the moral argument, and I get at least the one that I'm familiar with is that if God exists, then objective moral duties and obligations exist, and then premise two is that moral obligations and duties do exist, and the conclusion is that God exists. That's just the presentation that I'm familiar with.
right.
Is that one that I guess you would defend or
I wouldn't defend it personally because I don't. I think the Euthyphro dilemma is a good response. So I know that Craig argues like it's God's nature, God is the standard of goodness, and I guess the problem I have with that argument is that that's certainly possible. I mean, I do believe that that's true from a theological perspective, but an atheist isn't going to grant that assumption that that's the foundation for morality. They could argue that it's conceptual or that it's platonic, kind of like what Eric Wielenberg, or others may argue, and I see that as equally possible. Somebody could argue that as well. So I see simply arguing that it's God's nature. It's a possibility, but I guess the problem I have, or the Euthyphro dilemma, where I see it kind of undercuts the argument, is that if the idea is that you can't have moral absolutes unless God has decreed them, or I would say moral obligations and values unless God has decreed them, then that now makes those moral obligations and values seem contingent, that they had
mm,
to have come from God and they could have been otherwise. But if that's the case, that they could have been otherwise, then something like murder is now something that's not necessarily wrong in all possible worlds. And
mm,
to me, that's just obviously false. But once you grant, if you take the other side and say, well, no, they're necessary, then they could be, in principle, just necessary. And you say, well, they could only be necessary
yeah,
because they're a part of God's nature and God's necessary. Well, how do you know they aren't just necessary concepts? It's not like God is, thou shalt not murder. Like, to me,
mm,
that's hard to even conceive. And Craig rejects divine simplicity. And yeah, I mean, I just see that as really rubbing against the argument. And Craig, yeah, I just don't buy the response that Craig gives.
no, well, uh, no, I see what you're saying. I guess typically my response to the moral argument, the moral argument, is to take a sort of a emotivist approach to meta ethics, in that I guess there is no such thing as objective right and wrong, and typically that's my approach to it.
Sure, yeah, and I know that's a popular approach that gets taken. So, yeah, I mean, I have a big problem with the motivism.
Yeah,
It's something I actually don't. I mean, I understand it well enough that I get what it's saying, but I don't understand how it doesn't just collapse into relativism. And relativism, I don't see how that doesn't collapse into nihilism. And
mm,
like to me, morality is largely based on, to me at least, the concept of justice, which is an applicable concept that we apply all the time. And to me,
mm,
that's an objective concept. It's just it's something fairly obvious. I'd say like if one person's treated one way, another person's treated another, I say well, you're being inconsistent. That's unfair. That's unjust. And to me, that's just an objective statement. It's much different than if I were to say, vanilla ice cream tastes better than chocolate ice cream. That just seems like a total opinion. But if I say
yeah,
that was fair and that was unfair, that doesn't seem like an opinion. That seems like it's just a factual application of our concepts.
yeah. No, I think that to say that something is fair or unfair is certainly it's in a way to objectively describe the world. Um, but I think we start going into more sort of roots of value when we say that fairness is good and unfairness is bad, and that we ought to do that which is fair. I think that's when it starts to lose objectivity.
So it seems like your objection there is more against the obligation than the value.
Um, well, no, objections are still surrounding the value. In the moral argument, it's um, objective values, but I don't think there is any such thing. I'm skeptical that the concept of an objective value is even a coherent concept. Because I think the nature of value is approval and disapproval, and that's inherently subjective.
What would you say if I say something's not fair? Would you say that's subjective or that it's objective?
Um, if if by fairness you mean there's an inconsistency in how people are being treated, then I think that's I think that it's the term that I prefer to use is to say that it's a proposition that's cognitive and that it makes an attempt to describe what is going on in the world and it can be true or false. But the to say that um, fairness is good is non-cognitive. That it just can't be true or false. It's not a statement about the world so much as it is an expression of how we feel about it.
Hmm. So, I mean, but you recognize there's an obvious inconsistency if I were to say, you're treating one person one way and somebody else a different way. We have this concept called fairness,
Mm.
and that it doesn't seem like it's just an opinion to me at least. It seems like it's applying a concept in the same way that I would say, um, all plants that grow out of the ground with bark we call trees. To me, that seems objective, and to me, applying a concept like fairness seems just as objective as that.
Yeah, I think in a descriptive sense, if by fairness all you mean to say is that you are describing an inconsistency in between two different people are being treated, um, then absolutely that is equally as objective and as cognitivist as say your analogy with bark and tree. Um, uh, but my issue, I have an issue with uh, saying that fairness is good and that unfairness is bad, and then we ought to do that which is fair and not ought not do that which is unfair. Once we start using that kind of language, then it loses its objectivity, and then that's where I think emotivism is just a great explanation, a great ethical theory.
Right. So you're not objecting so much to the objectivity. It seems like of the concept of fairness. You're objecting to it having a goodness or an obligation to it. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay. Right. So I guess I would say it just seems intrinsic to fairness that it is good, but I'm just trying to think here because I mean I recognize that objection. I'm thinking if there's a good way to respond to it. Um, yeah, I mean I think that that's a fair response, but to me, the fact that we have a concept like fairness that does seem objective to me gives us an does make that distinction between opinions and objective statements that it's to me it seems like emotivism collapses into pure opinion. Now I understand that it seems like you're saying, well, it's more pure opinion about what is good and what is obligatory, not so much opinion about what is fair and unfair. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yeah, yeah. I think so. I guess the term that I would prefer to use over opinion would just be preference, um, and that's approval or disapproval.
Sure. Okay. I think that's a fair response. I guess from my perspective, though, if a concept like fairness, um, to me, that's enough. And maybe I'm not reflecting a standard position here. To me, that's enough to have objective morality. The fact that we can objectively speak about fairness to me that is objective morality. Now, whether it's good or whether it's obligatory, these are some extra labels that we can throw onto it that you could say, well, that seems like it's preferential, but I don't know that it necessarily needs those labels in order to have objective morality.
But I don't think that I guess just the description of fairness or not is enough for an objective morality. Um, I guess because just as just as descriptions of the world are a big part of morality, so are prescriptions. And I don't think that from the description of fairness or unfairness, we can reach any prescriptive conclusions about what we ought to do. Um, yeah, Hume's law. You can't get an ought from an is. It seems to me that it doesn't matter how much fairness or unfairness is going on. That you just can't reach a conclusion about ought we do that which is fair or ought we do that which is unfair.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with that objection. I don't think you can get an ought from an is, although there's been some responses to that. But I guess from my perspective, and this is where I guess I would bring in God, not to prove the moral argument, but from my perspective, it could be totally God's opinion that people should be fair and loving and so on. But I guess I'm fine with that. It's I guess, yeah, I don't know that I can prove that being fair is objectively good and obligatory, but I think that that's the system we should have, and I think an emotivist could agree with that. And I guess I could also help that from my perspective, where the moral argument seems plausible to me, and I don't think this makes it work, but the idea that we have objective concepts to begin with, and maybe this gets off the moral argument and more into like the argument from reason or like a Neoplatonic kind of argument, but the
Mm,
idea that there are these objective concepts that we can attain to, the idea that that would be derived from another mind outside of our own, that's where I've always found the moral argument to be plausible. It's like, okay, I didn't come up with the idea of murder being unjust or and so on. I must have gotten that from another mind. Now, that's not the way Craig presents it or others present it usually. It's more like murder is bad and, we have an
yeah,
obligation to not murder. And yeah, I mean, the motivist response, I think that could work against that type of argument as well. I guess my intuition is I go down a different route, and I don't think that other version is convincing, at least deductively.
mm,
But anyways, that's what I think.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess that is. I guess that does kind of sum up my objection to the moral argument. I don't accept that um, there are objective moral values or duties. Yeah. No, you would you agree that fairness is good?
I do think it's good, but I recognize, I mean, that's totally based on an intuition,
Yeah.
which to me is a strong starting point, but I know that gets us back into our discussion about intuition.
Yeah.
So.
Um. So when you say that it is good, what you mean is strongly linked to the intuition.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. When you say that fairness is good, is that are you just going on intuition? But from that, yeah, what exactly is it that you mean when you say that it's good?
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, the word good is kind of one of these fuzzy words. I would say that it's something that we should pursue, something that has value, but then that can be kind of circular. I mean, we get to these base terms, and goodness, I guess, is kind of a base term. I guess goodness, by goodness, I would mean something that's worth attaining.
Mm,
To me, it seems just intuitively obvious that being a fair person is something we should pursue, and I have to think that emotivists agree with this, but then they say, yeah, but it's just our opinion, and I don't know.
mm,
I just part ways there, but
yeah. Yeah. Well, um, I guess it does seem to me that you yourself do seem to be coming, I guess, from an emotivist point of view when you speak, and you say it just seems intuitively good. That is just like you're saying, I approve of it. And I guess it does seem like you yourself, not at least in the language that you're using, seem to be, emotivistic. Would you agree or disagree with that? Or,
It depends upon what you mean because like my intuition could be that the goodness is intrinsic, but I don't have like a
okay.
deductive proof of it. I'm just saying like it
Oh
just
yeah.
seems that way in the same sense like it just seems like I'm experiencing reality going back to intuitions that we talked about earlier. I don't think it's merely opinion, which seems to be more where emotivism is coming from. I
Yeah.
think that it is truly good, but I don't have an argument beyond just saying that it seems that way.
Yeah. Oh, oh well. Um. Uh, how long have we been talking now? Do you know?
Looks like about an hour and 6 minutes, so I don't know what your time frame is. I'm good either way.
No. Well, I'm maybe trying to squeeze in something else if you're okay with that, and then
Yeah, definitely.
call it there. Do you want to maybe talk briefly about the kalam?
Sure.
Do you accept the kalam?
I think that it's plausible from an inductive standpoint.
Mm,
I don't think that it works deductively as a proof for God. So I think that it makes sense that the universe had to have a beginning from different arguments that we could talk about. But I don't know that from there you can arrive at a divine being had to be the cause of the beginning of the universe. I
no.
think it could be. I don't think you can prove that the universe came into existence at it, like that there was absolutely nothing and then it came into existence. And it seems like the Kalam wouldn't have to rest upon that, but it seems like if you're going to give that up, then it does lose some force from the argument because the beginning of the universe could have been intrinsic to the universe itself at that point. That I think at most, I am convinced the universe had to have a beginning. At least I think that's pretty plausible seeming, or at least the first moment. From a
Mm,
theological, faith based standpoint, I do accept the universe came into being through God's creation, but from a deductive, philosophical point, I don't know that we can prove that. And then the scientific literature I'm not educated on, and also it
mm,
seems like science is going to be probabilistic in nature, so it's going to be debatable. So that's where I come from.
all right. Well, I don't have really any issues problems with. And you said, um, my position on it is I guess I reject the first premise that that everything that begins to exist is a cause. Um, it I guess it does sort of go back to that discussion about intuition and conceivability. Um, but yeah, I don't accept the first premise. I the Whether or not the second premise is true, for me it really doesn't matter. Um, I think I've heard William Lane Craig mention a theorem. I can't remember. Uh, I can't remember the name of it, but that proves that mathematically the universe had to have a first moment in time. Um, Whether or not that premise is true doesn't mean a lot to me. Um, I uh, I do have a problem. I think you mentioned this with most people, the way that most people speak of the universe beginning to exist, and that there was some state of nothingness, and then the universe popped into that or came into it. I don't accept that view, but I do. I would be, I'd be happy to accept that at least there was a first moment in time, and that time doesn't infinitely regress into the past. Um, but yeah, I guess I also have an issue with uh, there's a one of the reasons that I reject the first premise, everything that begins to exist as a cause, is because there are two types of ways to come into existence, and that is creation ex nihilo and creation ex materia. Nihilo being from nothing, and materia being from other existing material, and everything that I have ever seen come into existence has been creation ex materia, from stuff. And so, although I don't accept that everything that comes into existence from creation ex materia has a cause, I would be more inclined to accept it than something that comes into existence creation ex nihilo as a cause, because I've never seen something come into existence creation ex nihilo. Yeah,
All right, yeah. So Craig gives a number of different, or there are a number of different arguments out there for a beginning, like a first moment.
yeah,
And the one that I find, and I know I'll get to the other point in a second, but the one that I find convincing is the idea that if there was no first moment, then how would we have arrived at today? Because you can't pass through an infinite. And I know there are objections to that. I don't find the objections to that argument to be convincing. To me, it seems pretty logically inescapable, but I find arguments like that to be pretty
yeah,
convincing. But in regards to the causality point, yeah, I mean, like all of our experience, or at least for the most part, if things coming to be are rearrangements of matter. So, like, rearrange matter, and now you have a water bottle. The water bottle
yeah,
came into being, but it comes from the pre-existing matter, so it wouldn't be an example of creation ex nihilo. Now,
yeah,
I'd argue that like the soul is created ex nihilo, but then that gets into questions about that. But
yeah,
I don't. I guess it's more from a there are two ways to approach that premise. Number one, so one is the deductive way, that how can something come out of nothing? Of course, a Humean type objection to that kind of undercuts it. That something popping into being isn't necessarily being derived from nothing, and I think Craig recognizes that that can be an objection. He phrases it in different ways though. But then another objection is, if things could pop into being out of nothing, then we would see it happening all the time, but we don't. So, and there are some objections to that argument as well. But yeah, I am inclined to agree with that second argument though, that something if things could really come into being out of nothing, then why don't we see it happening all the time? And anyways, I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
I've never really, I guess, understood the appeal of that argument. Um, yeah, if it is, if it's, if it is, if it's possible, and if it is the case that the universe came into existence acausally, uncaused, I don't see why that would bring us to come to accept that, or to come to uh, predict or imagine that things should be, or ought to be, popping in and out of existence all the time. Um, I really don't see where the expectation of that comes from. Um, Another issue that I have is that it's almost sort of like a fallacy of composition, where just because the universe itself could come into existence acausally doesn't mean that anything within the universe necessarily needs to come into existence acausally. It could be that the universe began to exist causally, but everything within the universe requires cause.
Right. So a couple of points there. So your first point about the appeal of the argument, I think the appeal is that it's like, if this could happen once, what's to stop it from happening again? Like, where's the barrier? It's kind of like saying, like, if like, what's an analogy I could make here? I don't know. I mean, any analogy is going to be,
Yeah,
just a reiteration of the point. But basically, like, what's the barrier to stop it from happening all the time? I think that does seem fairly plausible from an inductive standpoint, not a deductive proof, but I think there is a reasonable expectation. Like, okay, it happened, once. You would think over billions of years, or even, all our daily experiences, we could see it happen all the time. But your second point, that that's within the universe, not
yeah,
outside the universe type of thing, I think that that's a legitimate point, in the sense that it could be that the universe is what prevents things from popping in and
yeah,
out of existence all over the place. So there is a reason why it doesn't happen all the time, because the universe prevents it from happening. However, you could then raise the point, why doesn't the universe cease to be at a given moment? Why don't the laws of physics cease to be at a given moment? And I think from an inductive standpoint, that's a legitimate response that somebody could raise to support premise number one.
Yeah. Um, well, I guess there was a lot of questions there, and I don't think that I guess my failure to answer any of them in any way supports this the proposition that God exists. Um, you ask, it has happened once. Why can't it happen all the time? And why doesn't the universe stop? Why doesn't it cease to be? My answer to that is that I just don't know. But I don't think my admission of ignorance has any support that God exists. But one point that I guess I would like to make is that I'm not saying that I guess the universe prevents things from inside the universe uh, popping into existence, uh, but rather perhaps it's just the nature of things inside the universe that they must come into existence causally, not that the universe is restraining them from coming into existence causally. Just that's just how it is, and there's no reason for it.
Right. So that was, yeah, and I mean that was my point of how I would respond,
Yeah,
or how somebody could respond to. Because I mean, if somebody accepts the plausibility of the claim, like, hey, if things can come into existence without a cause, why don't we see it all the time? Somebody could respond, well, okay, we should expect it to see it all the time, except that the universe prevents it. I was putting that forward as a response that somebody could give,
yeah,
and then I would say that a rejoinder then could be, well, what prevents the universe from morphing into something else at any given moment? And it's not a, from there it doesn't prove God, but it, to
yeah,
me, it does lend support inductively to premise number one if you accept the plausibility of like what's constraining all these things from coming into being out of nothing.
yeah,
Anyways, yeah.
yeah. I mean, I don't accept that in order for things to not be coming from nothing, that there has to be something that restrains them from coming from nothing. Yeah, I definitely don't accept that.
All right. Now, you also made the point about it's the nature of things. Now, it could be the nature of something to remain in existence, although that gets into a question there about sustaining and such. But I guess it wouldn't be. I don't know if that would apply to the idea of things that don't exist. Like, what would stop those things? Like, if one apple could come into being, why can't another apple come into being? You wonder the applicability of the laws here.
Mm. I mean, I guess one thing that um, I certainly that I don't reject is that perhaps there is no reason for it. It may be the case that an apple pops into existence, and for the rest of eternity, no more apples pop into existence. And it may be, people may be inclined to ask, why is that the case? Why if one could, why can't more? Uh, but maybe it just is that way. It just is that way, and there's no reason for it. I am curious about your thoughts on an acausal beginning of the universe, because I think I'm not I don't commit myself to any uh, I guess position on the beginning of the universe, but that is a I do think that that's a position that I never seem to see entertained by anyone. That uh, that there could have just been no cause.
All right, sure. I want to respond real quick to the other point you made. So it seems like the uniformity of nature has a plausibility to it, but I guess and then if nature is uniform, then why would there be certain exceptions unless it was a miracle? And then
Mm,
if one thing can come into being without a cause, then if nature is uniform, then other things could come to be. So where's the uniformity here? But you may not accept a total uniformity,
yeah,
but
yeah,
I guess that's how I might respond there. But in regards to so is your question about could the universe have begun without a cause, or
yeah. I just I would like to know your thoughts if I guess you consider that to be possible or plausible, an acausal beginning.
I mean, from an atheistic standpoint, you could defend it if you take like a Humean view of causality. If you think
Yeah,
something could pop into being without out of nothing, I would say if one's convinced by a contingency argument, if everything is contingent on the necessary reality, then I don't know how something could come into being without the reality's permission, so to speak, or causal allowance of that to be. So that's where I really think the contingency argument is so paramount, is so fundamental, because it gives you all these other attributes of God. I think it gives you a lot more than the other arguments do. Yeah, that's where I come from on it. So I guess from a theological standpoint, I would say no, it's not possible. But that's also because I accept the contingency argument. But
yeah,
but if you don't, if somebody wasn't convinced by that and they took a Humean view of causality, then I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess there's no contradiction in the universe just beginning out of nothing.
yeah. Well, I guess not so much. I guess coming out of nothing. Like
Coming to be a causally.
yeah, yeah. Um, because I guess I am inclined to take that position. Um, are you at all familiar with Scott Clifton and his usual? Yeah, I think my position on that was very much influenced by his videos in the Kalam and his back and forth with William Lane Craig.
Yeah, I've
Yeah,
seen some of those. Yeah, it's been a little while.
mm,
Yeah, to me, the Kalam argument, it has an intuitive appeal. I definitely think that the universe must have had a beginning moment, but from there, I think it becomes more debatable if it what the cause would have to be. I think somebody could argue that it's intrinsic to the universe, that it would have a starting point. Um, yeah, I don't think it's a proof of God. I think it adds some plausibility to
yeah,
theism as a cumulative case, but I'm not convinced as that it's an absolute proof
yeah.
of God. So
I'm curious about one more thing. I guess it's more about an cumulative case for God's existence, and that there may be that all of the I guess arguments for God's existence might fail deductively, but that they may, in some sense, sort of gather some accumulation of evidence. Is that something that I guess you would defend, or
I'm not a huge fan of it because if all the arguments fail on their own, then like sometimes it gets put forward like, you have a few loose strings, but that makes a strong chord. And I'm thinking like, yeah, but what if all the strings are loose? I mean, then you don't
uh,
have a strong chord. What's going to
uh,
strengthen all these chords? So I recognize the attraction of that. I'm not saying it's I don't think it's necessarily illegitimate, but yeah, I'm not inclined to agree with cumulative case arguments for philosophical. Like an atheist could put forward a cumulative case for atheism, and I would probably just try to poke holes in the argument and say, look, like none of these arguments follow absolutely,
yeah,
so I'm not convinced by your cumulative. So I'm not a big fan of a cumulative case, but I recognize that some people could be.
yeah, okay, yeah. 'Cause I was watching a debate with Alex Connor and Cameron Bertuzzi, and Cameron seemed to defend that during the debate, but it does seem to me that yeah, I really don't like that argument very much. I'm just wondering what you thought on it. It does seem to me that if you have it doesn't matter how many zeros you add together, the answer will always be zero. And yes, in the case of um,
Yeah, and I guess they would say it's not a zero. They would be like, well, it's a
yeah,
point whatever, and you add a point whatever to a point whatever, you might get up to a point 999, and then that would be. But to me, the difficulty is with a philosophical argument. Like I think you can make a cumulative case for like a historical argument or a scientific argument because we're dealing with things that we have more direct access to evaluate them in comparison to something else. I could say, hey, this seems to fit with this, and it kind of fits together like a puzzle. But with a philosophical argument, we really don't have a puzzle to put together so much. We're dealing with a kind of unknown. So if it doesn't deductively follow, or you're not like convinced of it on its own, I don't see how another argument would add weight to it necessarily. I get that I guess I mean I get how it might work. You might say, okay, this argument's kind of convincing and this argument's kind of convincing, so they all support each. I mean, I get how it could work. I'm not saying I don't know that it couldn't work, but I just really think in philosophy, arguments stand or fall on their own. I don't.
Yeah.
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 I know. Yeah, I don't remember Cameron saying that, and I did watch that debate. If it was the one on unbelievable, I think he
I think
might
so.
hold that view. I know he's a fan of the contingency argument, but I know,
Yeah. But
yeah,
I thought
he might have
I,
said that. I don't know, but I
I
know
don't
like
think
Craig puts that view forward.
yeah. I don't think it was the one on unbelievable.
Oh, okay.
I think it was hosted by Inspiring Philosophy, and they spoke about the moral argument. I think that's what they said. I could be wrong.
Oh, on capturing Christianity.
Yeah, could be
Okay, I
wrong.
haven't watched all of that one,
Yeah.
so okay.
No. Well, um, do you have any, objections to these? Because I think I may be out of them.
Oh, do I have objections to what? Sorry.
Just anything else to add? Just because I think uh, that may be my thoughts on the contingency and moral arguments,
In the
just about
column.
summed up in the
All right.
kalam.
I guess my question might be, what do you if you have to pick a strongest argument for theism, if you have to, what
Yeah.
one would you pick?
Um. I mean, there is none that of course, that I accept now to be deductively, like, completely valid and sound. But in terms of, well, I guess when I first heard them, and I wasn't aware of the objections to them, which did I find to be the most intuitively compelling? It would have been either the fine tuning argument or the ontological argument. I think they two seem the most, at least to me, first, the most intuitively convincing.
All right, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, I have some thoughts on those arguments, but okay. Now, have you read two books that I think are pretty interesting in regards to the contingency argument? I don't know if you've come across these, but Ed Fazer's The Last Superstition and Josh Rasmussen has a new book called How Reason Can Lead to God. Have you come across either of those?
Yeah, I've heard of Ed Faisal's book. Yeah, I've had that recommended to me by a few people. I haven't read either of the two,
Okay.
but I have heard the Last Superstition. I'm not familiar with the latter book though at all.
Okay. Yeah, Josh Rasmussen, he appears a lot of times on Capturing Christianity. I think he's debating Scott Clifton on there in a few weeks, actually,
Oh,
on the contingency argument. Yeah, he has a new book that came out a couple of months ago called How Reason Can Lead to God. I would definitely recommend it. It's pretty interesting. He goes through the contingency argument, but some other stuff. It's pretty good. But yeah, Fazer's book is good. Fazer has several books. The Last Superstition, I think, is probably the most digestible. I think it's my favorite of his
yeah,
books. You know, he's a Thomist, so he argues contingency arguments, but he's more arguing it from Thomas Aquinas's perspective, which I think is plausible. It's a little different, and um, anyways, I would definitely recommend those. So.
yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah, I've never read a book in apologetics. I've been looking, I guess, where to begin. Um, I was thinking maybe have you read anything by William Lane Craig? I was thinking maybe that's
Oh,
where I
have
should
I
begin.
read it? I haven't read many. I've read one of his books. I haven't read many of his books, but I've read a lot of his stuff on his site. He has a Q&A and stuff. He has a lot of articles on there. I've read a lot of
Yeah,
those.
yeah. No, so you, if I were to, if I would, if you were to recommend me a first book in apologetics, would that be The Last Superstition?
Yeah, I would recommend that, and primarily because it's very different than Craig. Like, I'm assuming it sounds like you've watched Craig's debates
Yeah,
and
yeah.
things.
I'm most familiar with Craig. Yeah,
Yeah, and Phaser and Craig, in some ways, they're at odds in their approach because um, Craig takes a more of that cumulative case kind of approach,
mm,
and
mm,
Phaser takes a more deductive approach, which is more
mm,
where I side with. And then Craig has been critical of Phaser's views of adopting Thomistics, or the views of Thomas Aquinas and
mm,
his metaphysics, and then Phaser has been critical of Craig for rejecting it. So it offers a really different perspective. Um, the book itself is a little bit, it's pretty critical of the new atheists like Richard Dawkins and things.
Well,
Yeah, but I think you would enjoy it. I would definitely recommend it. Yeah. Anyways, that's the one I would recommend to start with. Yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. How long have we been talking now?
All right, we're about at an hour and a half, so if you need to go, I can let you go. But if you had anything else,
Yeah. No, I don't think so. No. Maybe another time we can talk about some other theistic arguments. But yeah, I think it might be my bedtime now.
okay.
Thank you very much for the conversation.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks so much for coming on. We should do this again sometime. It was good.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and if anybody's out there watching, I don't know if we even have volume, but go ahead and subscribe, like the video. If you want to debate, let me know. And all right, we'll go from there. Thanks. See ya.
Right. Thank you very much. See you
Yeah.
later.
Bye. All right, let's